Thank you. I beg to move that this House has considered e-petition 563473 relating to press freedoms and safety of protesters in India. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, Mr Stringer, and I am grateful to take part in this return to Westminster Hall debates with virtual participation, something I know many members are grateful for, as well as giving e-petitions awaiting a debate the public hearing which the petitioners deserve. Farming protests in India may not seem the most obvious issue for a petitions debate, but the committee has always accepted petitions calling on the UK government to engage with other governments on human rights issues. The petition focuses on the protest scene in Delhi and across India following the agricultural reforms agreed by the Indian Parliament. The petition calls on the UK government to urge the Indian government to ensure the safety of protesters and press freedom. It argues democratic engagement and freedom of the press are fundamental rights and a positive step towards creating an India that works for all, and calls for transparency and accountability from the Indian government. The petition has already been signed by over 115,000 people and has until the 17th of June to run, a fact which highlights the public interest and topicality of this issue. The close ties and many family connections between these islands and India are another factor. The petition was created by Gurt Singh, whose family is from a farming background in the Punjab, after the distress he observed when he found his mother in tears watching the Indian news channels' coverage of the protests. He then spoke with relatives in India about the distress they were in and with members of his local community, and it is testimony to his efforts that his local area is in the top 10 constituencies for signatories. Giles Verniers, a political scientist at Ashoka University, has said every farmer community everywhere is discussing these farm laws. It is not just a local or regional matter. He's right, it's even found its way to be debated in these islands. The farming protests are complex in their nature and origins. Indeed, even as a member who takes a keen interest in India and has family connections there, I must admit that prior to this debate being scheduled, I had little knowledge on the subject, other than having seen some brief news footage of clashes between farmers and police and riot gear, from which I had gleaned that it was something to do with farming laws, and that several high-profile celebrities, such as Rihanna and Greta Thunberg, had spoken out about it. I'm grateful to those who have taken time to speak with me over the last few days and to those who have provided briefings. The Commons Library, the Indian High Commission, the petitioner and several political contacts with first-hand experience have all greatly assisted my understanding of the issue. Today, we are not having a debate about the merits of the agricultural reform bills passed by the Indian Parliament. The UK government has repeatedly acknowledged that it is a sovereign matter for the government and people of India. In its diplomatically worded response to the petition, the UK government stated, "We respect that agricultural reforms are a matter for India." This newfound support for self-determination and sovereignty from the UK government is quite encouraging. Those of us from Scotland are paying close attention. The Indian government's right to enforce law and order is also not in dispute, and again has been repeatedly acknowledged by the UK government in its statements on the protests. In its response to the petition, the UK government stated, "We also recognise that governments have the power to enforce law and order if a protest crosses the line into illegality. We look to the Indian government to uphold all freedoms and rights guaranteed in India's strong constitution." However, this debate is an opportunity to note concerns raised regarding the safety of protesters and press freedoms in reporting on the protests. To help those who may be coming to this from a similar knowledge base to where I was a week ago, I believe the background to be as follows. It can be argued that the farmers have been ripped off for generations, that the sector requires reform and that they have suffered a huge loss of income due to the COVID lockdowns. Agriculture is controlled by the state in India, and 3 farm laws were passed by India's Parliament last September, resulting in opposition from farming groups. There are arguments about the constitutionality of the laws, and that is an issue for India's own legislative and judicial process. The farm laws allow for the first time farm gate sales to corporations, put an end to warehouse capacity limits for processors, and introduce tax-free privately owned corporate yards, or Mondays. We have heard reports of water cannon and tear gas being used against the protesters in the early stages of the protests, repeated clashes between police and protesters, and the suspension of mobile internet access and social media accounts in late January and early February. There are good links to reputable sources on these events in the House of Commons debate pack. Sadly, several farmers have suicided in protest and others have died from exposure during the winter conditions of the protests. Indian farmers have been occupying roads around Delhi since the 26th of November, and on the 26th of January, Republic Day, they drove over 120,000 tractors to the capital. The vast majority of those taking part, it should be stressed, did so peacefully. This was, I believe, inspired by an American farmer's tractorcade, which brought Washington to a standstill in 1979. It's a small world. Across India, some 750 million people are directly engaged in agriculture. That is around half of India's population. Land has been described as sacred and farming seen as a religious duty or way of life. It is a very significant issue for India. This issue has a resonance with the Indian diaspora around the globe, and also for concerned environmental and political activists. While the protests have been largely peaceful, they have on occasion involved the use of direct action, such as strikes and blockades, which have disrupted road and rail traffic. The most significant clash between police and protesters so far came on the 26th of January, when one protester died and more than 80 police officers were injured after protesters deviated from an agreed protest route, including breaching security to enter the iconic Red Fort in Delhi. The BBC cited local media reports of police using tear gas and batons and of protesters driving tractors targeting police officers. The violence was condemned by farmers' groups and union leaders. In response to the violence, the Indian Ministry of External Affairs put out a statement on the 3rd of February arguing that the violence on the 26th of January had been the result of vested interest groups influencing the protests, and that Indian police forces have handled these protests with utmost restraint, despite hundreds of police officers being attacked. The statement also noted that the government has held multiple rounds of dialogue with protesters' representatives and farming unions, and had offered to suspend the implementation of the laws, an offer rejected by farmers' unions who want to see the laws fully repealed. Following the violence at the end of January, the Indian government also temporarily suspended mobile internet access in 3 areas around Delhi, where protesters had gathered. The Indian government claimed the suspension was in order to maintain public safety. The UK government has since acknowledged and welcomed the removal of the restrictions on internet access at protest sites in its answer to House of Lords written question on the 22nd of February. However, Amnesty International on the 9th of February released a statement calling on the Indian government to stop what it referred to as an escalating crackdown on protesters and farming leaders, citing reports of arrests, threats and harassment of peaceful protesters. The International Press Institute has taken the matter up in its communication directly with Prime Minister Modi, in which they urge him to take immediate steps to ensure that journalists can work without any harassment and fear of reprisal from the government, and to direct the state governments to drop all charges against journalists, including those under the draconian sedition laws that have been imposed on them for their work. Press freedom and the right to peaceful protest is central to any democracy. So the images over the past few months emerging from India are deeply worrying. Some 67 journalists were arrested and detained last year alone. The escalation in violence and the press crackdown, including over social media accounts, cannot simply be ignored, especially at a time when the UK government is keen to strengthen ties with the Indian government. As the world's largest democracy and a key regional player, India has a pivotal role to play on the world stage. That is why it is vital that the Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary impress upon our Indian partners our joint convictions on free speech and the right to protest. In conclusion, I look forward to hearing the contributions to be made in the debate, and I hope the Minister can advise if these concerns will be raised by the Prime Minister on his trip later this year. Thank you.